So up next in the course, we're going to just take a look at loops. So there are three types of loops we want to look at in terms of examples. So I'm going to do one example of each of these loops in the program. If you have any questions as we're going, feel free to ask. So in terms of loop examples in C++, the three types we're going to cover is we're going to do a for loop, we're going to do a while loop. Anyone know what other kind we might do? A do-while loop, right? And what's there between a do-while loop and a while loop? Yeah?
A do-while loop will execute the body first before running through the expression.
Yeah, so a while loop, what it will do is it'll have an expression first, and it will evaluate that expression, and then if the expression is true, then it will execute the body of the loop. And then it'll check the condition again. A do-while loop will actually execute the body and then check. So that means it will always execute at least how many times? Once. That's right. Whereas a while loop or even a for loop may execute 0 times. So let's do a for loop first. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to show you how you can use a for loop just to add a bunch of numbers together as a starting point. So let's create an int called sum, and we're going to start off initializing it to 0. So the format of a for loop is a for loop starts off with, it has 3 parts. Can anyone tell me what the first part is? In terms of, it has, yeah, you could define it different ways. We're going to look at a standard way. The first thing is we're going to have some counter for our loop. And we're going to say int I equal to 0. So that's the initial value, so the initialization part. So we're going to say for int I equals 0, and we're going to go for I is, while I is less than 100, or let's do less than or equal to 100. So what we're going to do is we're going to sum all the numbers from 0 up to and including 100. We're going to do I plus plus. That tells us how we're going to increment I each time we run the loop. So what this is going to do is it's going to start at the number 0, and until I is equal to 100, or while I is less than or equal to 100, it's going to add 1 to I each time. So just to see how this looks, we can do this. We can print out I is... Now, if we just run this here, what will this do? It will print out all the numbers from 0 to 100, right? So if we actually run this now, let's first compile it. And yeah, you can see we printed out all those numbers. So it looped through and printed out those numbers. Now, what I said we'd like to do is we'd like to actually sum this. So how would I sum this? Yeah? Right? And what I could then do is after this loop I could see out the sum is, so what this will do if we run this now, it'll still print out all those i's, but at the end is it sums up all the numbers. Right? Yeah? So what I was going to just tell you, thank you, someone just pointed that out in the class. Sum equals sum plus I. When you have this sum on the left-hand side and sum on the right-hand side, there's actually a short form for this that you can use, which is sum plus equals I, which will basically say sum equals itself plus I each time. And if we use this instead and rerun the program, we'll see that we get the same value. So does that make sense in terms of a for loop? Is there any questions? Okay, one thing I want to point out as well is that you can do for loops in different ways. For example, we could say I equals 100, right? And say while I is greater than or equal to 0, I minus minus. What will this do? It does the for loop in reverse, right? It starts at 100, and while I is greater than or equal to 0, it will decrement or decrease I each time. So if we run this, we still get the same sum, but instead of starting at, like we see here, starting at 0 and going up to 100, we instead started at 100 and went down to 0. Right? Yes?
What if we like did I plus plus instead of I minus minus? That goes like into
Yeah, if we had typed I++ by mistake here, we would actually see that this, in fact, is an infinite loop. And you can see it just goes on forever. I'm going to stop it. Because what happens here is we start at 100, we count up each time, but what's our end condition or termination condition would be while I will never be, in this case here, below 0. Yes?
If we ran it long enough, but I loop around once it hit the
No, it'll end up eventually crashing once it runs out of space for an I. So once you get to an integer that can no longer be stored in the size for C++, it will actually just terminate. It'll crash. Something else I want to show you is what about if we didn't want to count all of the numbers? What if we only want to count the even numbers? How would we do this in this case? I'm going to change this back to 0, and I is greater than or equal to 100. So what if we only want to count the even numbers? How would we do this? Yeah? Well, we could do that inside, right? So what you were suggesting is we could put an if statement here which says if I divided by, or if I mod 2 equals 0, then we're going to do the stuff. We could do that, but the other way we could do it is we could actually change how we're incrementing here. So rather than go through every number, right, we'll simply say, hey, each time we run the loop, instead of doing I plus plus, we can do I equals I plus 2, or I plus equals 2, which will, instead, if we run this, what we'll see here now is that, look, it actually starts up here at 0, goes 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. And it tells us what the sum of all the even numbers is. Make sense? Okay, so that just shows us a little bit about how we could do for loops. So let's actually do a while loop example now. For this one, let's actually start off with creating two integers. An integer x, which equals, say, 130, and an integer y, which equals, what's a big number?
2,147,000,047.
How about that? 2,134,343. Is that okay? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a while loop, and whenever we hit a number that is less than y, or whenever we hit a number that's less than y, that's divisible by 130, we'll print out a message. Make sense? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a while loop here. We're going to say while, and a while loop is so first off, unlike a for loop, which has a count sort of where you go 0 up to something, increment or whatever, a while loop just puts an expression here. So it looks just like an if statement, except instead of an if, it has the word while. So here we're going to say, well, y so while y mod x does not equal 0. So we're going to count down and find the largest y below 2,134,343 that's divisible by x. Okay? And we're going to print out actually, let's do it this way. Sorry, I should have put a y here. Okay, and each time, what are we going to do? We're going to go y minus minus, right? Does that make sense? And then once we're done, we should hit a y that is divisible, right? So I'll just say it has a mod of, just to show that it is, I'll say y, in this case here, oops. So what I'm actually going to do as well is I'm going to, because this is a long line, I'm going to actually put it like this. We'll do y mod x. Or should we, actually, maybe what we should say is with, I'm going to put the division symbol here. Oh, my typing is horrible. And then what I'll do is I'll do y divided by x. So we'll see how much it's equal to. Make sense? Any questions about this? Besides the fact that I messed up here and should have put this. Any questions? So let's actually see. What do you think that, anyone have a guess at the number? Well, 130 is probably going to be divisible by 130. I know at least that, but let's see. And why don't I just so that we can, I'm going to actually comment out our for loop result here, just so that we focus on the while loop for now. Okay, so let's compile our program, see if it compiles, which it does, and we'll run it. Oh, actually, we got kind of lucky, huh? So, first off, because it's 130, we knew this loop, how many times, what's the max this loop's going to run? What? 129, right? It's going to run somewhere between 0 and 129 times. If the number itself was divisible by 130, it wouldn't have run at all, right? The body would never have executed. And instead, what we would have seen, just simply that the number itself was divisible. But what happened here was it first decreased it down by 1, then again, and then the fourth number that it tried was actually divisible. What about if we tried something more interesting? Let's say we did this. And try this. I'm saying interesting because I don't actually know. Yes, question first before I try it.
Are the brackets necessary? We did y divided by x.
Right here? No, that's a personal preference. So we could actually have gotten rid of these. And it has to do with order of operations. So if I compile this, it's going to be fine. And you can see here, I like to do this when I have an expression in a cout, in an output statement. I typically put brackets around it as a style thing, just so it's really clear and obvious that this is a self-contained expression. That's a personal preference. Okay? So how many times did this actually, it ended up going to, it ran a few times, right? So we started out with, what number? 2,134,343, and it went to 2,133,415. So actually that one, it ended up going through just over, just about 900 numbers first. Make sense? Do you guys see how a while loop works? So the difference here in a while loop is you have an expression here, right? But unlike a for loop where you have some sort of count up here where you're doing some sort of action on where you're decreasing or increasing the I value. In a while loop, you actually have to make some adjustment to one of the variables in the expression in the body of the while loop. Right? So if we hadn't put this y minus minus here, what would have happened? What? If we had not put this here, assuming this wasn't equal to 0, it would have printed the same number over and over again in what's called an infinite loop, right? And in general, infinite loops are bad. Are they? Okay. So, any questions about while loop before I move on to the do while loop?
How would you quit from the loop early? Do you have to make the expression false, or can you do return or break?
Okay, so say for example I said, you know what? Let's do this. Say we had an int z equal to 0, okay? Say I wanted to do something where I only want to check 100 numbers. This is arbitrary. It doesn't really make sense, but that's okay. What I could actually do here, say I had a z here, where I increment, I just said, hey, if z equals 100, where I have to use both equal symbol, then I'm going to break. Okay? Because maybe my number is this. And I'm just going to say, hey, I'm only going to check 100 numbers here. Right? If I checked 100 numbers and I haven't found one, I'm not going to worry about it. Okay? So in this case here, if I did this, what you'll find is our program actually gave us something that's a little bit, what does it say here? It says that number is not divisible, which it wasn't, and then it says it is divisible because we had this if statement here, but what has happened now is this if statement is no longer true. We actually just broke out of this. So we used the break statement just to get out of it without finding an answer. Okay? Now we could actually fix this by saying here, if this actually had an if statement, right here. Now what we'll see is, in fact, it doesn't display out the wrong messages. It just basically tries 100 numbers and breaks out of the loop. So that is something you can do. You can break out of these sometimes and stuff. In general, to be honest, I find I don't use the break a lot in most loops. Most loops, it's sort of one of those things where you can use it, just like we used it in a switch statement, but it's not. It only has a value in certain cases. And if you overuse it in some ways, it just overcomplicates. Like in this case here, there really isn't a reason for doing it except that I showed it because someone asked about it. But in this case here, this just sort of overcomplicates the code a little bit in my mind. So, if you only wanted to check 100 numbers, I probably would have just done a for loop for 100 and then just checked numbers. Do you know what I mean? Like as opposed to doing it this way. But anyway, it is something to mention. So this one here, I'm going to do a do while loop. So for this one, I'm not going to initialize my value. I'm just going to basically do a do, and then after the do, you put a while. And I'm going to do this for, and this one here, you need to have a semicolon here at the end. And I'm going to basically have a print statement after this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop. I'm going to create a loop here that will loop while the user enters a positive number. It's going to loop. And it's going to break out when it's a non-positive number. Okay? So how would I get input here from the user? Somebody tell me? Well, first, what would I like to do first? Before I use cin, what should I do? So I want to ask, enter a positive number. And I'm going to leave no end line here because I want to enter the number on the same line. Now, how do I do the cin here? Somebody on this side, the left side of me. What? Oh yeah, I should have. I'm I was thinking of the while loops, I guess, and I was putting it after. Yes, thank you. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to put, what do I need to do here now? Somebody give me something. Cin input, right? Now, if somebody enters a non-integer input here, our program might crash. But I'm going to assume now, when you're doing input and output like this, often you want to do error checking to see in cases where somebody maybe enters in input that's incorrect. So in some ways, this is a form of error checking, checking when you're asking for a positive integer, checking that it's actually positive. But normally what you'd like to do is you'd like to see if it's positive. If it's not, ask them to enter it again. So we're sort of doing a backwards thing here, but I just want to show you how this would work. So let's actually give this a try now. And what I'll do is up here, I should have done this to start, is I'm going to just comment out my while loop so that we're only looking at the do while code. So let's compile and let's run. Enter a positive number. Somebody have a good favorite number? 1, 16, 9. You guys think big. Big. What's a big number? 142. That's 420. What? What's a small number? -6. You entered a non-positive number. It worked. So, and of course, if we did the same thing again, and I didn't need to compile them, but if we did the same thing again, and we'd entered 0, what would have happened? Same thing. Now, what happens if I did this? Right, it tries to interpret. So what happened here it did something funky here where it tries to enter it again, and it has to do with, basically what we're looking at here is, in the loop here in this case, it took in, if we actually, actually what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to put a cout statement here. So you can see more what's going on. So I'm just going to have a cout statement here which just says what you've entered. It just echoes it back to you. So let's compile this, run it. So we tried 2, we can see it's 2, right? 342 says 342. Now, 1.2, which is what we tried before, what does it do? What it did was it took in the 1 first and said, hey, 1 is a number. Then it got to this and tried to interpret that as an integer, and what happened? It just ended up assigning it 0, it said, and then it was a non-positive. So basically what you're seeing here is when you're doing this, if you type in a lot of, so for example, what if we had done this? What would happen here? What? Yeah? It says you entered 1, you entered 3, you entered 45. Right? So you could type, so it basically it's like there's a buffer. So when you start typing these things, if you had typed 6 integers on the input, it would have done the cin, it would have run it 6 times with those positive integers. But in general, what you're expecting somebody to do is to type it like this, where they type one number at a time. And we'll see later how we can do write our program so that we can protect against people typing in weird stuff. Like if somebody wanted to type, not that Albert is, anyone named Albert? Okay. Albert is not a weird name. But if somebody typed Albert, what happens? It doesn't recognize this as an integer, because it's not, right? So we'll see how we can actually protect against that types of input. So that's an example there of a do-while loop. So we've seen an example of a for loop, while loop, and a do-while loop.